Hello. In the previous lecture, we have discussed some of the important ideas of Ricoeur. Particularly, we discussed about the symbolic interpretations. In this lecture, we will now focus on how Ricoeur makes a shift from interpretive conflict to the ontology of understanding and eventually move to the practical philosophy which he embraced in the latter years of his life. The interrelation between hermeneutics and understanding is one of the focal points of Ricoeur's book, The Conflict of Interpretations, which he published in 1969. Ricoeur maintains a fluid dialogue with another philosophical current, namely philosophical structuralism, that was born hand in hand with linguistics and that would reach a good portion of the science of language in the 1960s. Structuralism chose to defend the anonymous functioning of science systems without subjective base. Before a text, there are two possibilities. An internal one that carries out the analysis of the units that make up a discourse, and an expanding one that searches for the meaning of discourse understood as a whole freighted with signification. Ricoeur recognizes the technical interest of the first possibility, but he inclines towards the latter, which is inherent in the hermeneutic task. For this reason, Ricoeur's hermeneutic model in this stage cannot be reduced to a group of interpretive rules necessary for carrying out a primary interpretation. Instead, he proposes a hermeneutics oriented towards the discovery of being through the multiple modalities of discourse in which being is expressed. This line of hermeneutics coincides in its philosophical aspiration with Heidegger's hermeneutics of facticity, even though Ricoeur will speak of different paths, at least in two ways. In the first way, Ricoeur is not the same as that of the Heideggerian approach to hermeneutics. The path of Heidegger in hermeneutics is an ontology of understanding that advances in the understanding of being through an existential analysis. So it is not that way Ricoeur would follow. Ricoeur adopts his own path. He takes reflection to the ontological plane through a long hermeneutic circling of the plurality of the discourses of being. In this sense of Ricoeur, being coincides with being interpreted. The eye cannot be analyzed from itself, but only through a large detour of signs, symbols, and figures of culture, from which results the impossibility of a single universal hermeneutics. There must be various styles of interpretation, and consequently the emergent ontology also must be contingent. It cannot be substantialist, militant, and always dependent on the development of the interpretation. It is impossible to consider an ontology of consciousness as absolute because being, consciousness, and the I are all results of interpretation. And for this reason, they should emerge at the end of hermeneutic reflexive activity. So the starting point cannot be the ontology. It comes as a result of hermeneutic reflexive activity. This large circling or the long path leads Ricoeur to delve into the different discursive modalities in which being is expressed, with textual hermeneutics becoming the next object of his attention. Ricoeur also thinks of the world as a text. The world that the text generates is peculiar. It enters into conflict with the real world in order to describe it. It remakes the real world, taking advantage of all the figures that language offers in order to speak about reality. The writer makes use of all the expressive elements within his or her grasp. And all of this in order to re-describe the world and insert it into a definitive and apparently unchanging mode of existence, namely the text. It is not possible to understand the meaning of a text in an immediate emphatic manner, such as the romantic hermeneutics advocated by Schleiermacher. But neither is understanding entirely achieved through the structural analysis of the science systems that make up the text, such as the structuralism proposes. The hermeneutics proposed by Ricoeur aspires to understand texts on the basis of intention, on the basis of what the text tells us in our present circumstance. For this reason, it is not the author's original intention when the text was written that we must discover. In order to accomplish this understanding, the interpreter must overcome a distance, a cultural distancing. Every text for Ricoeur produces a double hiding that one must overcome in order to understand it. That of the author in the first place, who is absent from the reading and interpretation process, and that of the interpreter, who is absent from the writing process. Because of these essential traits of the text, Ricoeur's textual hermeneutics will center on some important aspects. I will enumerate 4 of them. The first aspect is autonomous meaning. Meaning is autonomous in relation to the author's intention. The second aspect is plurivocality, or the opening of meaning. Once the common situational world of orality is shattered, in order to produce the world of the text, there are multiple possibilities of meaning. The third aspect is the activity of the reader. It is the reader who opens the work, and therefore he is the one who is responsible for completing the text. The fourth aspect is text and the self-understanding of the subject, who discovers through the reading process of new project of being in the world. This is exactly in the same sense as Heidegger. Ricoeur practices a hermeneutics in which the meaning of the text is a conquest of the interpreter, who understands by understanding. He understands himself by understanding the text. He understands the text by understanding him. Reading introduces us in the imaginative variations of the ego, the self, and reminds us that we are being characterized by an opening to the world of the other, which is also the world of the text. By incorporating the meaning of text to our understanding, we as humans broaden our visions of ourselves. A text invites us to interpret a proposed world that could be inhabited by us. This double itinerary of meaning that goes from the interpreter to the text and from the text to the interpreter is also found in metaphor, recovered as an expressive and even a hermeneutic element in the 20th century. Paul Ricoeur will reclaim a new hermeneutic style based upon the living metaphor. Metaphor is alive not only because it livens up an already constituted language, but above all because it produces the need to think more at the level of concept. The poetic destiny of language constitutes the possibility of expanding speculative discourse. And for this reason, the value of metaphor resides in its ability to create meaning, whose recovery we assign to hermeneutics. We will now briefly focus on the practical stage in the philosophical itinerary of Ricoeur, the last 15 years of his life. In the year 1990, Ricoeur publishes another famous work, Oneself as Another, Soi-même comme autre in French, a book that marks the transition from hermeneutics to practical philosophy. In this work, he delves into the concepts such as narrative identity, personal identity, and the problem of human action in all its dimensions. His effort to shift from the text to action had been manifest in various hermeneutic works, in which he had incorporated the perspective of the British philosophers of language. In this work, he will develop the 4 different levels that make up hermeneutic and ethical perspectives. The first level is language. The language that is spoken by the person who speaks. The second aspect is action. Action that is done by the agent. The action could involve not merely the moral action, but any action, even suffering is an action in that sense. The third level is narration. This refers to the person who narrates. And the fourth level is ethics. Refers to the person who is responsible or who behaves responsibly. It is precisely within the framework of this book where Ricoeur presents his little ethics, as he himself calls this very fondly, the petit ethique, little ethics, as a contribution to moral philosophy, in which he analyzes the ethical and moral determinations of action related to the categories of the good and the obligatory. The passage from hermeneutic philosophy to practical philosophy has thus been realized. As far as the shift from ethics to politics, it comes about as thematic continuity by exploring the question of the other. The idea of the just corresponds to what we could call a public ethics that strives to elucidate, as stated in the title of one of Ricoeur's essays, the place of the just between the legal and the good. With this, we do not go beyond the realm of practical philosophy that seeks to determine the extension of the idea of the just. What sense can we make out of the fact, after having discovered Ricoeur's philosophical works, which end up in practical or moral political philosophies? Why does a philosopher who has devoted himself for 3 decades to hermeneutics, his main creative stage, and end up working in practical philosophy? Maybe there is no one single answer to these questions, but only a collection of circumstances that have to do with the manner of philosophizing practiced by Ricoeur throughout his life, plural and with a permanent conflict of interpretations. We should, however, remember the constant concern for humans, for the person, which Paul Ricoeur reminds us of time and again. Ricoeur has always manifested this concern as the unfettering force that leads to this practical final stage. In all of its stages, his philosophy has remained true to a philosophical anthropology, determined to unveil the meaning of humans, of their manner of expressing themselves and behaving. It is an anthropology that is not always easy to detect because of Ricoeur's rejection of a short path towards speaking about the subject of its existence, of being. In effect, the long path, the path of hermeneutics of action that involves studying the expressions and discourses of humans in order to arrive at knowledge, leads inevitably to the practical realm. The action of human, the suffering human, the able human, the responsible human is the subject and supreme object of any practical philosophy. But one does not arrive at this human directly, but only through the mediations used to make sense of his or her existence. For this reason, Ricoeur has carried out such an ample dialogue with the various philosophical currents and proposals that have made relevant contributions to knowledge of the human subject. Psychoanalysis, phenomenology, structuralism, analytical philosophy, among others. His philosophy responds to a project of reconstruction of the subject through the discourses used for expression, such as symbols, myths, texts, figures of language, and narrative plots. Thank you very much.